So, World War II marks yet another evolution in war and how wars are fought. Not only in the methods of which it fights, but in, again, similar to World War One, who fights wars and who can be targeted in wars and how we produce and mobilize our resources for wars, right? So, first, let's talk about the actual fighting of war because World War II causes two major revolutions in war. So in the years between World War One, like we said in the last section of the video, to avoid the stalemate and the meat grinder that is trench warfare, the German military begins to innovate new technology to suit a new, more mobile style of warfare. Now, this is possible because of technological advancements in that 20-year period between World War One and World War Two. Things like tanks, things like airplanes, um, military armored vehicles, all of these things have evolved significantly in the 2 decades after World War One. So unfortunately, trench warfare is not going to be an option because the Germans and their aggressive style of warfare with their blitzkrieg and their highly maneuverable army force the other armies to adapt. So war evolves beyond this stalemate meat grinder style of trench warfare and it becomes very mechanized, very fast, and very agile. Another thing that happens in terms of the evolution of war is that weapons that in World War One were only mildly used and mildly ineffective become the primary means of warfare. Air warfare becomes integral to the success of the overall war. Air superiority becomes an absolute necessity in order to win on the ground. From fighter planes to dive bombers to long range, high level, what we call carpet bombers, all of these types of aircraft basically clear the way and support ground troops and ground efforts. At the same time, naval warfare is evolving as well. The hallmark of naval warfare for probably the previous 600 years or so, which is the battleship, large, heavy, well armored ships with massive guns, essentially become obsolete during World War II. Because of the advances in aviation, naval aircraft become the dominant force. Large, heavy, well armored battleships can be sunk relatively quickly and easily by a relatively small force of naval aircraft using high level explosives and torpedoes. So the aircraft carrier becomes the new symbol of dominance in naval warfare. And these aircraft carriers grow to enormous sizes, especially in the Pacific, you know, with crews in the thousands, basically becoming entire floating, self sustaining cities for the most part. Now, the majority of World War II is fought in this way with highly mobile, highly agile, quick moving conventional forces. But thanks to the United States, the war and how wars are fought evolves again in August of 1945 when the United States drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this creates a second evolution of war in under a decade. And it's going to create a new types of arms race after World War II, and it's going to create all new conditions during the Cold War that war must be fought under because of the destructive power that is the atom bomb, right? So this is a high altitude photograph of the atomic bomb drop on Hiroshima in 1945, right? So this is what Hiroshima looks like in 1944. Busy, bustling streets, highly industrialized, very, crowded. this is what Hiroshima looks like after 1945. So, needless to say, the destructive power of warfare, thanks to modernization and mechanization and advances in science and technology, um, is forced to evolve yet again to deal with this level of devastation and the threat of this level of devastation. Now, one of the unfortunate hallmarks of World War II is the human cost. World War II is a total war in terms of what we talked about with World War One, in that all sides mobilize every resource and every part of their population to fight the war. However, it's done on a far more intense scale. World War II ends with over 60 million dead, at least as many wounded, but on a scale that World War One could not even imagine, over half of that dead and wounded are civilians. And because of the high level of civilian involvement and civilian motivation in winning the war effort, on both sides, civilian populations become accepted war targets. And this is something that, while not brand new in the history of warfare, because we've talked about the Mongols and their policy on uncooperative cities, but for entire nations to directly, knowingly, and willingly target non combatants is something that warfare has not seen on a large scale ever in human history. Obviously, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki instantly kill somewhere around 150,000 Japanese civilians. The Germans during the Battle of Britain mercilessly bombed London and other British cities, killing thousands of civilians. The Allies, again, are not innocent in this. Two of the most devastating attacks of the war are the firebombing of Dresden in Germany and Tokyo in Japan. In both cases, these attacks create massive fires that burn both cities essentially to the ground over the course of several days. Again, killing tens of thousands of civilians. Now, another thing that leads to the intense brutality and the increased human cost of the war is the racial, cultural, and ideological aspects of the war. Because in many ways, this is a war of ideologies. In many ways, this is a war of extermination. The level of brutality against one's enemy is not simply limited to enemy combatants. The civilian populations are viewed as legitimate targets of war. And again, the level of brutality thrust upon them is, you know, what, something that hasn't been seen in human history in terms of its size and its scale. The Japanese slaughter, rape, and torture the Chinese civilian population during their invasion of China. The German invasion of the Soviet Union is marked by all kinds of human atrocities and war crimes. And the Soviets do the same thing when they begin to push the German army back and they enter Germany. The Red Army commits many of the same atrocities. The Japanese are notorious for their torture of prisoners of war, especially British and American prisoners of war. And again, at the same time, the Allies are not innocent in this. The Allies mercilessly bombed civilian targets all over Japan and Germany over a 4-year period. Basically, somewhere around 79 million tons of explosives are dropped on Germany just by the British and the American Air Force. And so the level of devastation is unheard of. So similar to what I just showed you before, this is the city of Dresden in Germany. It was one of Germany's top manufacturing centers, which therefore made it a massive target for the Allies. And they bombed it again ruthlessly throughout the war, especially um, especially destructive was the firebombing of Dresden in 1944, which, again, as you can see, this is the results of the level of destruction and the level of targeting of civilian populations during World War II. And I mean, this is a German city, so this is what the Allies did, and the Allies are again supposedly the good guys in this narrative. Another aspect of World War One that is rather frightening and shocking is the level of brutality directed against women during the war. Now, similar to World War One, women become heavily employed and economically and socially empowered in many of the combatant nations. This is the era of Rosie the Riveter and all that. But in the field of battle, the level of abuse targeted specifically at women, again, because of the ethnic and the racial aspect of the war, reaches Mongol levels. There is widespread gang rape among enemy armies. The murder of women and children, especially between the German army and the Soviet army and their reprisals, um, leads to entire villages, entire towns, essentially being, exterminated en masse. Both the German and the Japanese army um, were well documented in terms of sexually enslaving captured women. The Japanese were especially well known for this in China, where they would kidnap large, you know, large numbers of Chinese women and ship them off to Japanese army camps to serve as what they called comfort women. At the same time, the war also, in its aftermath, leaves somewhere between 40 to 50 million people homeless. So what this creates after World War One is a social catastrophe that almost overwhelms the infrastructure of every country involved in fighting the war. Um, and this is going to play a massive role in the upcoming Cold War because both the Soviet Union and the United States take advantage of the social and economic crises caused by World War II to essentially throw money at anybody who's willing to be their ally in order to rebuild after World War II. And this is going to further the Cold War that we talk about later on in the next unit.